Okay, welcome everybody. I have to say, it is quite a strange thing to stand here as a speaker when I've been emceeing sessions for so long, but I'm really delighted that everybody's here. So, to start, I want to ask you to cast your minds back to a certain weekend in July of 2023, when a significant cultural phenomenon took place. So in July 2023, weekend of the 21st of July 2023, something happened in which humanity showed its true colours, and it turned out that the true colours of humanity were black and pink, because on the weekend of 21st of July 2023, Barbie and Oppenheimer came out on the same weekend. We had the cultural phenomenon of Barbenheimer taking place. So what was interesting in that time was wherever you looked, you had sharply juxtaposed media. You had articles commenting on modern feminism, and right beside them you had articles commenting on the chemical nature of the atom bomb and whether or not the world was going to end potentially in the next few years. So, I mean, what a time to be alive, very surreal time. You might also remember that around that time, because of Barbie, Billie Eilish released her song, What Was I Made For? And there was a point where every single video on social media, every single reel had Billie Eilish in the background with What Was I Made For? Do you all know that song, by the way? I'm not going to make you sing it, but okay. Just in case, for those who shook your head, these are the lyrics. I used to float, now I just fall down. I used to know, now I'm not sure now, what was I made for? I think I forgot how to be happy. What was I made for? What was I made for? What was I made for? So if there were a song that captured our modern existential angst and then won an Academy Award for it, that would be the song. And there was a point where it was impossible to open social media and not be reminded by Billie Eilish of our fragile mortality, like literally every second of the day. But what was really interesting to me is that within the first week of that song's release, that song was streamed 155 million times in the first 7 days of that song being released. And I didn't look up the data for how many people went to see Barbenheimer. Oh, actually, we could take a quick poll. Who saw Barbie? Who's seen the Barbie movie? Oppenheimer? And hands up if you saw both. Okay, interesting. Humanity shows its true colours in this room. All right, anyway, what is interesting to me, apart from that cultural phenomenon of those movies, that song being released, and the fact that it was so kind of universally resonating, is the reason why it was so interesting to so many people. And on the surface, Barbie and Oppenheimer are two diametrically opposed, even just aesthetically as well as ideologically. They're very, very different films. But I think it is very interesting that it kind of reflected back to us, the audience, these very deep questions, tapping into these very universal feelings of, well, what are we made for? What is it to be human? What is our identity? And that question that Billie Eilish kind of captures in that song, what was I made for? I think it does tap into that universal feeling of being potentially disconnected from purpose, unsure of the future. These are all very universal things that I think would resonate with anybody, just being human. And Barbenheimer, the cultural phenomenon of Barbenheimer, really did kind of speak straight into that question, even though they're two very different movies. So kind of existential angst, existential questions were cropping up since that weekend, that fatal weekend in 2023. So now we live in a time where uncertainty, I think, feels like a new normal, whether that's on a global level or it's maybe on a more local level or a personal level to you. There's threats of war. In fact, just today, Pope Francis called for a day of fasting and prayer to support peace in the world. The world's instability is real, and in the face of all this, the question of hope is one that kind of stands out in stark contrast. And I just thought, when we were looking at the topics for what could potentially be a session in our season of sessions, hope came up as a topic time and time again. And I think it's a very wonderful thing that you are all here, that I am here, that we're here because we want to hear something about hope. And we look at the world today and we see all of the troubles. We understand, I don't have to go deeply into how troubled our world is and how many challenges we face. So the question of today's session is, in the face of everything that we see, is hope a realistic choice? Can it actually do anything for us in the face of our struggles? Is there any point in hoping? So I'm really happy to tell you that my answer directly to all of those questions is absolutely yes. And I would assume that because you are here, you also think, or at least you hope the answer is yes. And I'm not going to dwell on any more depressing matters on that front, because you are, after all, here to hear about hope. So as a mentor and as somebody who works with young people and young adults generally with questions to do with life purpose, whether that be things to do with faith or belief, or just more broadly speaking about kind of the direction of their lives, one of the things I come across most often, even if it's like an unspoken thing, is this sort of underpinning caution about how to engage with and how to approach life. And if I had to put it into a phrase, this kind of sense that I get when I'm talking particularly to young people who are, looking at the world around them and trying to figure out how I engage with this world, what my position is in this world, if I had to kind of encapsulate the phrase, it would be something like this: I cannot afford to risk my safety or my happiness chasing something unrealistic, or chasing something that might be better, but I am not certain about. So there's a kind of solid caution, kind of risk averseness that I see in young adults as well, in adults as well, but I would say very particularly in our young people. Whether that's in relationships or careers, or perhaps it's a personal situation that people find themselves in, or perhaps, this might be something that you yourself consider. Caution, is it worth the risk? Is it worth the risk of hoping for something better happening later? Is it worth the risk of me investing my time, my energy, my effort? Is it worth the risk to hope, essentially, in the world as it is today? So, again, a really great thing is, yeah, it is worth the risk. This is what this session is about. One thing I do want to say that this is, before we launch in kind of into hope, you might find that this topic deals with things that are quite complex. They might bring up some things that are potentially quite complex for you or quite painful, because we're talking about topics of hope and despair. We're talking about, that kind of very human, very existential question of how much can I, should I, do I risk in hoping for a better thing in the future. So my plan is to bring you through a roadmap to kind of navigate the potential cynicism or the caution that we face in our world today. And these are the topics. Here's the roadmap. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the difference between feeling hopeful and hope. Very important distinction there. The second will be to look at hope as a virtue and what that means. In case you didn't know, virtue is one of my obsessions. I really do think it's very, very necessary for a full life. And the third is looking at whether faith actually makes a difference to the way that we live hope. Okay, so that's the layout. As Delphine said, later on, you do have me as a sitting duck for Q&A, so, bring it on, basically. Okay, so point number one on our journey through hope. What is the difference between feeling hopeful and hope itself? Is it an important distinction to make? I would say absolutely yes. We live in the kind of world where the only obvious guide we seem to have for ourselves is how we feel about a certain situation. Our reading of a situation and our decision about whether we do invest in that situation or the steps that we take forward very often seem to fall on, do I feel good about this? Or do I not feel good about this? And that sometimes dictates the steps that we take or the directions that we take. That's not to say that's a bad thing. I think that is just the way that we function. But I do think that it's important to make a distinction between feelings and something perhaps a little bit deeper, something a little bit touching more on what it means to be human. So when we ask the question, is hope a realistic choice? Does it do anything for us in our modern day? I think what we're doing often is associating hope with feeling good about the future. If we look at it from a different angle, when we've lost hope, what is happening is that we ultimately are driven by the feeling that the future does not hold something good for us, in general terms. This might manifest for you in different ways, but I think we can probably resonate with that basic description. If I feel good about the future, I'm hopeful. If I don't feel good about it, I'm hopeless. But I would say this is a really important distinction to make, that feeling hopeful is different from having hope or being a hopeful person. And when we're talking about positive feelings generally, what we're talking about is a biological response. If anyone was here for last week's session on anger, which was excellent, and it will be out on YouTube and socials, Becky, who was our speaker for that evening, talked about the role of dopamine and the amygdala in our kind of anger defense response. It was brilliant. It was really, really, really good and segues very beautifully into this. Basically, we have this biological system that helps us to identify what helps us to survive. So we get that little buzz, right, of dopamine, which is essentially a chemical reaction. And our brain is saying, hey, this helps you survive. We like this. Do more of this. Let's survive more. Survival is great. But what happens when the dopamine runs out? What happens when the feel-good feelings run out? If I live with the belief that hope is all about feeling good about the future, then the answer to the session title is no. Hope is not realistic at all in this day and age. It would be like fighting a forest fire of bad news with a small and very unreliable hose pipe. We would be consumed because we would not be able to sustain that kind of emotional level of feeling good in the face of the swamp of stuff that might happen on a personal, local, global, spiritual, emotional level. Again, the great news is that hope is something that is much more deep, much more enduring than just simple feelings. Feelings do play a very big part in how we live hope in our kind of daily lives, but dopamine might help us feel good, but hope, lived as a virtue, makes us actually good, and this is a very distinct difference. Hope is not just a feeling, it is in fact a virtue. So a virtue, I will refer here if you want to take a little detour into understanding virtue. I would refer to my session of 2023, I think it was, where I gave a session precisely on virtue. So a virtue is a character strength that is a good habit that we have to choose to live. That is, we have to kind of choose to live it and practice it so that it embeds in our character and our way of being. And the great thing about virtues is that they are accessible to everyone. Everyone can practice virtue in the same way that everyone can practice good habits. So, with hope, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the great minds of the 13th century, described hope as an act of the will, which means, if we have to unpack that into one sentence, it basically means that we have to intentionally choose to direct ourselves towards a future good, even if it doesn't seem possible, even if we don't feel good about that future outcome. Even if we feel hopeless, doesn't mean that you are without hope. This is one of the most hopeful things I can tell you, that things are not tied to the ephemeral nature of feelings, that actually virtues are tied to your being, to your way of being. I was just talking to a few people before this talk started, and somebody very kindly said, oh, I came to your talk on virtues. This is like self-promotion, it's terrible. But in the talk on virtues, what I did was I referred to The Lord of the Rings. So virtue is my number one obsession, The Lord of the Rings is my number two obsession, and I will always and forever refer to The Lord of the Rings because it is such a good descriptor of virtue in a wonderful masterpiece. Anyway, great example of this is in The Lord of the Rings. So, in this long journey to Mordor, for those of you who are not familiar with what happens in The Lord of the Rings, essentially there is a great ring of power that needs to be destroyed, otherwise evil will overcome the world. You know, your basic kind of cosmic battle of good and evil, which we all love. So, the ones who are trying to actually destroy this ring are two of the most powerless people in the entire work of fiction. So you have Frodo and you have Sam. So they're journeying through Mordor, which is this terrible, evil land, and they have basically all of the odds stacked right against them. And there they are, these two hobbits, these two tiny people, whose only powers are being able to eat 7 meals a day. That's literally their power. Hobbits eat a lot, they don't do much else. So, but these two hobbits, in their powerlessness, are tasked, they take on themselves this task of destroying this ring for the good of the world, basically, for the good of everybody else. So at this stage in this journey, they are at a very hopeless point. They don't have very much hope at all. They're in the middle of this parched land. They have very few supplies. They have no friends. And it's just the two of them making their way across this land. And there's a point where Frodo asks Sam if they have any water left. And Sam says, yes, we do, but we need to save some for the journey home. And in the film, this scene is depicted really beautifully because Frodo kind of just stares at Sam. Frodo's the one who's carrying the ring. He's kind of getting eroded day by day by the weight of this evil power that he's carrying, trying to destroy. And so Frodo just stares at Sam, like, what do you mean, the journey home? Because Frodo cannot see beyond the end. He can't see beyond the destruction of the ring. He actually hasn't envisaged the fact that he might make it home. Sam, however, who is basically the embodiment of all good things in this world, has always seen the journey home as an inevitability. He has never considered that they're not going to make it home. And in fact, he believes it so strongly that his actions actually follow on from this belief. We're going to make it home, so I'm going to save some water for the journey back. You can have some, but we do need to save some, right? So Sam practiced hope as an act of the will. He actually kept his eyes on a future, a good that Frodo could not see. G.K. Chesterton, who is a wonderful writer, lived in the 19th century, said, "Hope is as unreasonable as it is indispensable." And I think we are, like Sam, hopelessly hopeful creatures. Even if we are faced with these huge odds, these huge obstacles, I do think that there is something that is really ingrained in us that innately hopes for a better tomorrow. Even if that is buried under layers of broken trust, it's buried under layers of bad experiences of people in the world, I do think that there is this never dying ember of hope. And we see in Sam that kind of fruition of that buried seed of hope. Hope is as unreasonable as it is indispensable. And this is the key. Hope doesn't depend on feelings, and it doesn't depend on our assessment of the situation. It actually depends on something that is unreasonable, in inverted commas. It depends on our ability to look past the grimness of our situation, to look past the earthbound human perspective. We have these blinkers, right? We get locked into our own perspective. Hope depends on seeing what is good and possible rather than what is simply a likely outcome. So Sam and Frodo, it is very likely that they won't make it to Mordor. They really, if you know the story at all, you know how badly the odds are stacked against them. It's very likely that they will be killed in the attempt. They were literally powerless. They were very experienced. They couldn't fight. As I said, all they can do is eat. That's pretty useless when you're trying to, overthrow the powers of the darkness. But there was a slim possibility that they might just survive. And Sam's hope was that he would dwell intentionally on that slim possibility of a good future outcome, not just for themselves, but for the whole world. He pinned everything on that slim possible outcome. And that's what happened. They survived and everybody was saved. So let's now switch to a more real life situation. You may or may not have heard of Viktor Frankl, who is a psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the Holocaust. He wrote a very beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning, which I highly recommend that you read. It is like the brightest beacon in a very dark world. So he wrote, having observed who endured, basically, and the reasons why people endured in the face of absolute inhuman horrors, he wrote this beautiful line, amongst many other beautiful lines. "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." So this really speaks into this idea that hope, grounded in meaning, becomes our anchor in human suffering. Hope does not take away our struggles, but it does give us the strength to endure them for a greater good in the future. So at this point, I want to make a little detour out of the wise words of very wise people and into a personal lived experience. So I share this with you, not to make this about myself, but just to say to you that I'm not speaking kind of in pure theory here. I often say that hope is my favorite virtue. And the reason I say it is because it didn't used to be my favorite virtue, but I have good reason for it to become my favorite virtue. So I think all of us have some kind of experience with burnout in our lives. Some kind of experience where we've just burned the candle at both ends for whatever reason. And we've just ended up at a flat line, where things don't bring us joy as they used to. Perhaps we've suffered a loss. Perhaps we've just had an enormous kind of seismic shift in the way that we live our life, whatever it might be. But I learned this lesson in my early 20s when I went through a season of very deep burnout. And just to illustrate, I went back over my journals to find an accurate description of how I felt at the time, because just to assure you, I'm good now. That was like 10 years ago. I'm fine. But there was a line that really leapt out at me, and I'd written to myself, "I feel like somebody's removed my spine, but left my nerves intact. So I've lost my ability to move forward, even emotionally. I couldn't, everything was dust and ashes, literally, in my mouth." And for those of you who do know me, I'm a fairly joyous person, I'm a fairly driven person. So it was a difficult time. But while it was a difficult time, it became for me a classroom of hope. It became a masterclass of really learning what hope was. It was the time that I discovered the most liberating lesson of my life, which is essentially this, that hope is a possible choice outside of how we feel. It's a possible choice outside of how we perceive ourselves or perceive the world. And also that I didn't have to wait for things to change in a passive way. I could choose to believe that this difficult chapter in my life would not have the final say, And then, even harder, I had to keep choosing to act on the belief that this was not like the final say. Pope Benedict XVI said, I didn't actually quote him directly here, but I'll have to track it back to find it, but he says that real hope has a transformative impact. So we might think that hope is just kind of these optimistic feelings, this wishful thinking that actually has no impact on the way that we are, the way that we live our life, the way that we engage with the world. But actually, it really does. It affects the way that we live. It affects our engagement with the world. And we have to make those choices to make sure that we are actually acting out what we choose to believe. This is the thing about virtue. The good news about virtue is that it's universally accessible. It's within the realms of possibility for us all. The bad news is you really have to try. Like, you actually have to try. So for myself, what happened was in that season of darkness, I asked for professional help in therapy. I leaned on my friends and family. I had to learn how to be vulnerable. My God, is that difficult? I changed the habits that I could day by day, and I prayed. So I can't talk about this challenging but ultimately very transformative phase of my life without talking about hope within the context of faith. So we've already said that hope is not a feeling. It is an active choice that we have to make to really believe and act in the hope of a better tomorrow. It is universally accessible, as we've seen. It's within the realms of all of our choice, our acting of the will. But it does run the risk of being just a good mindset. I say just. This is a wonderful thing, and I will forever be grateful for it. But I do have to reframe this, that within the context of Christianity, a good habit takes on a dimension that is far deeper and more enduring and more transformative than just a happy mindset. And this is, again, a lesson that came out of my classroom of faith, in my early 20s, my classroom of hope. So within the context of faith, hope takes on a very deep dimension. So hope as a virtue means that we don't just hope in an outcome or hope in a positive likelihood or an outcome. What happens is that we place our hope in someone, not in something, but in someone. And again, within the framework of Christianity, we place our trust, our hope in a God who is not distant, but a God who actually became one of us. A God who knows exactly what it is to cry, to suffer, and he walks through it with us. And I've just said a word here that I think is maybe the linchpin of our understanding of hope, which is trust. I think perhaps if we arrive at points in our life where we find it difficult to hope, to even just feel hopeful, to act hopefully, it's because we don't feel like we can trust the strength of ourselves to achieve that outcome, or we don't trust that the space we're going to land in is a safe space. And again, in the context of the world, that is totally understandable, and my heart goes out to every single one of you that has experienced that. But again, I think I'd be irresponsible if I didn't mention that within the context of faith, it is not a trust in an outcome, it's a trust in a person. And that trust is in the person who is above all the most trustworthy. And I had a conversation with a friend recently who said to me a very interesting question: how would you define the God that you believe in? And we talked about it a little bit, but essentially it boiled down to this: I believe in the God who stayed. This is a God who stayed. He became man and suffered intensely for the good of humankind. And so when we're talking about hope, especially in the context of Christianity, the God we believe in is a God of hope, the God who stayed. And if you look at the language of Christianity, we see it is a very deeply hopeful vocabulary. Do not be afraid comes out of the mouth of God, or the mouthpieces of God, via the prophets and the apostles. Multiple times, hundreds of times it appears in scriptures. Do not be afraid. I am with you. I have overcome the world. So we believe in a God of love, and a God of love who doesn't let us settle just for an ephemeral, happy mindset. He really wants us to flourish. He really wants us to invest in hope. So there is a poet whose name is Charles Péguy. He's French, and I'm really sorry if there are any French people in the audience. And he offers a very beautiful image of hope. He wrote this poem about the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. And this is such a beautiful poem, such a beautiful poem. So I'm just, if I could encroach on your patience for a little bit, I'm going to read just a little bit. But he describes hope as the virtue that is so beautiful that it surprises even God. So this is a little section. What surprises me, says God, is hope. and I can't get over it. This little Hope who seems like nothing at all. This little girl Hope. Faith is a loyal wife. Charity is a mother, an ardent mother, noble-hearted, or an older sister who is like a mother. But Hope is a little girl, nothing at all, who came into the world on Christmas Day just this past year, who is still playing with her snowman. And yet, it is this little girl who will carry all the others, she alone who will endure worlds. As the star guided the three kings from the deepest Orient towards the cradle of my son like a trembling flame, she alone will guide the virtues and the worlds. So I encourage you to read the rest of that poem. It is absolutely stunning. And he just makes a very interesting point, 2 points here. First of all, that we tend to think of the other two virtues, like the bigger virtues, charity, faith, like stalwarts, the older sister, the mother figure, and hope is walking between them like a little child. And we kind of forget hope, right? We know a lot about faith, we know a lot about charity, but we forget hope. And he paints hope as the child who is not walking behind these two older sister figures, but she is leading them. She's actually walking into a future. She is the one who keeps them and us walking forward. So that brings us very nicely into the final section of today's session, because this whole walking forward thing is easy to say in theory, and believe me, I know it is very difficult to actually live it. So here is the last part. It's the big how. How do we actually live hope as the most realistic choice that we can make in our lives? One thing is to reframe negative thoughts. This is a very basic kind of practice. I say basic, it's again not that easy to do. When we get stuck in a negative thought loop, what happens is we see everything as a negative. We just kind of blindly look over all of the good stuff, blindly. And the more we do that, the more we shut out the possibility that there is actually good stuff. And it's so easily done. Again, remember, we're sort of fighting this forest fire of bad news, of stuff that around us that is quite negative. So, focusing on what is going right. What can I learn from this? What is actually going right, no matter how tiny it is? Even if, you're stuck in this awful interview situation and you're just not going to get that job and you just didn't answer any of the questions right, you know what? You showed up. That's pretty good. I know it sounds basic, but that's still a good thing. Even if it's basic, doesn't stop it from being a good thing, right? If you're the sort of person who struggles to get up on time, extra points for you. 10 out of 10, gold star. Practice gratitude. Hope really flourishes when we practice this attitude of being thankful for the good things that are genuinely in our life. Hope dies very quickly when we are not grateful. Really, really quickly. Setting small, achievable goals. When we make progress, hope flourishes. And again, it's about identifying those small steps, but also actively trying to make those small steps possible for us is really, really good. Surrounding yourself with hopeful people. This is a nice thing. Just think about the friendship group that you have, or the family around you, or the friends that you've kind of chosen for yourself that just kind of ended up in your life. Are they the people who lift you up? Are they the people who are able to look at a situation and go, do you know what, this is pretty great. Like you're doing really well. I had a great situation just now. I hope the girls don't mind me sharing this. But, 4 of us had met, some of us for the first time, and literally within seconds, the compliments were flying like, girl, your skin looks amazing. And I was just like, this is the world that I live for. This is great. There are so many things that we could have chosen to talk about that are not so positive. But you know what? Your skin is glowing. 10 out of 10. Okay, surround yourself with hopeful people. Hope thrives in community. So if you find that it is difficult for yourself to be hopeful in whatever way, it could be that you need to maybe add a few more hopeful people, a few more hopeful influences in your life. Then, act of kindness. Hope is not a selfish virtue. As we see with the example of Frodo and Sam, it is a completely communal virtue. It is something that overflows to help other people to light the way. So doing something kind for someone else can spark hope in both them and in you. And it reminds us that we are actually connected in this very fragmented, very disjointed world. One really kind act can spark a whole revolution. And finally, hope is a virtue, as I said. And within the Christian framework, do you know what this means? It's not just a belief. It is not just an act of the will. It's also a gift. Hope is a gift that you have to ask for. And our God is so good. The God that I believe in is so very good, so personally concerned with your well-being, that he sets hope up as a very accessible thing that we can engage with. But he is also such a gentleman that he respects our free will and will never impose a gift that we didn't ask for. So when I was in that very dark classroom of hope, I had to ask for it again and again and again and again, and the gift was given. We don't just believe in a God who stayed, but a God who listens, and a God who wants us to live and flourish. So I really encourage you to ask for it. If you are a person who prays, this is a great prayer. If you're a person who doesn't pray, all I say is, don't shove it off your radar. It could be a really good beginning prayer to begin with. God of hope, give me hope. Trust me, it works. Okay, and really finally to close. So I began by quoting Billie Eilish's song, what was I made for, what was I made for, what was I made for, existential angst, angst, angst. And I actually think it's appropriate to close with the final verse of that song, because the bits of her song that went viral were the saddest parts of the song, and nobody was quoting the final verse, which is so hopeful. This is how it goes. I think I forgot how to be happy. Something I'm not, but something I can be. It's something I wait for. It is something I'm made for. So the question of today's session is hope a realistic choice? It's not just a realistic choice, it is the most realistic choice that we can make, because you are literally made for hope. You're literally made for a better tomorrow. And it's essential for our fullness of life as humans, because we're not just made to survive. That's what your dopamine is there for. It's to help you engage with habits to survive. But hope is given to us so that we actually thrive. It's given to us so that we are able to live a very full life that is full of love, to believe in better things, to make better things happen for others. And now ultimately, hope is a gift, it is an act, and it is a choice. So it is one that I really, truly hope that you consciously make. And that's it. Thank you very much.